90 engines had to be run and trimmed. These are Pratt & Whitney's largest commercial engines to date. Finally, engineering, manufacturing, and the flight test crew approved the 747 for taxi test. Jack Waddell, the chief test pilot, moves the airplane out. Landing gear and steering mechanisms are tried in a series of turns. And then, high-speed taxi. Braking, thrust reversers. After a few days, and in spite of extremely cold working conditions, airplane and crew were ready for the first flight. Now, February 1969, a cold and rain-sweaten day. The hoped-for break in the weather is not there, and they wait. Wait for holes in the clouds that cover Springfield and Everett, Washington. Then, just before noon, the weather breaks. Takeoff gross weight, 467,500 pounds. Airborne, requiring only 4,300 feet of roll, each engine producing 39,000 pounds of thrust.
Long here, heading 240, 1,500 feet, little turbulence. There go, folks, that turbulence up very nicely. Reporting up. Turn coordinator is working, doing its job normally, apparently, and the airplane is just excellent.
It is, with airspeeds up to 160 knots. And now, they're heading home.
One thing I was noticed throughout the whole plane is many things black smoke come out of there. You can't tell if the Marcellus Indians are running or not.
That's clean, all right. They're on the ground as well.
In the final approach, basic airspeed is 140 knots. Landing weight, 440,000 pounds.
Hi, Al. Jack, how are you? Good, good. Well, first things first. That's good, always. Thanks. Okay, Jack, natural question is, what are your questions? Well, Al, I guess this sounds completion or something. That thing is just ridiculously easy to fly. It's just a pilot dream. Really nice airplane to fly.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Livesey. Wanted to do a presentation on the 747. It turned 55 this year in February. I felt it was a pretty important airplane in the scheme of things in aviation. It changed the world for better good for a lot of reasons. But let me get started. Well, Joe Sutter, who headed the 747 program, dropped his wife off at the Sonoma Field edge of the runway at the exact point he believed the airplane would take off on that cold February day in 1969. And you saw that with the film. The aircraft flew off the runway where he predicted. What began was 50 plus years of the 747 that changed humanity and the world. Boeing was never a leader in the commercial airplane market. Douglas and Lockheed, with the Constellation players, they were the premier prop airliners and jet turboprop before the 707. They only had limited. The Model 247 in 1933, the Boeing 307 Stratoliner in 1938, the Boeing 314 Flying Boat, and the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. The 307 was the first airliner to offer a pressurized cabin. That's the one on the top right. The Boeing 314 Clipper was a flying boat built for Pan American Airways. Only 12 were put into service because of the outbreak of World War II, and that curtailed the deliveries. All were retired by 1948. The last was the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser for long-distance journeys that was derived from the military KC-97 tanker and the B-29. Its reliability was poor due mostly because of its large radial engines. The Pratt & Whitney 4360 had issues with cylinder temperatures and propeller control issues. They actually had a Stratocruiser ditch in the ocean because of they couldn't feather an engine. The only advantage Boeing ever had with all these models is they were derivatives of military designations, and they all had higher cruising altitudes than their competitors. With the advent of jet engines developed after World War II from Germany, Boeing designed two phenomenally successful jetliners, the B-47 Stratojet in 1947 and the B-52 Stratofortress in 1952. Those two jets went a long way in the development of the first Boeing jetliner, Model 367-80. The Dash 80, William Allen, Boeing CEO, had committed in 1952 to take on Douglas and Lockheed in the commercial transport market with a $16 million capital expenditure to develop the Dash 80, KC-135, and the Boeing 707. The design used the 35-degree swept wing concept, like the Stratoliner and the Stratocruiser. And the Dash 80 was a proof of concept model that was never going to be certified. Launched in 1952, Boeing set the aircraft in motion with an engine on wings design. They felt it was safer to have the engines break away from the wings versus to have a common picture here with the fuselage-mounted airplanes. The airplane set the standard for jets in the future. The rollout of the Dash 80 was in May 1954, with the first flight July 15, 1954. Famous Boeing test pilot, Tex Johnson, there's a picture, one of those There's another prototype, sorry. This is a picture of Tex Johnson. He was the test pilot for the Dash 80. He rolled the airplane over Puget Sound during the 1955 Seattle Seafair. Bill Allen was not amused and summoned Johnson to his office and asked him exactly what he was doing. Tex replied, "I'm selling airplanes, sir." That little stunt produced a flood of 707 orders. Juan Trippe, Pan Am CEO, was the key drive behind the development. They also developed the KC-135 at the same time. And also, Juan Trippe ordered 25 DC-8s at the same time to kind of surprise Boeing to make sure they were doing their job. So the split order caught Boeing's attention to work harder on the 707's single aisle design of 6 abreast seating. The split order caught Boeing's attention on working harder on the 707 with the 6 abreast seating coach class. This design would carry forward for all future Boeing narrow bodies, 727, 737, 757. 707 prototype first flew in December 1957, and that's one of the prototypes. Pan Am's first revenue 707 flight was October 26, 1958. Thus began the jet airliner age. The 707 opened the floodgates for airline jet orders and passenger travel. Boeing won big with the 707 by providing a standard of safety and comfort. An example of the explosive jet travel growth was Hawaii had just 172,000 visitors in 1958 compared to 1970 when over 2 million people visited. Wow. During the early 1960s, the United States military studied a series of projects for a much larger transport than the current Lockheed C-141 Starlifter. The capable aircraft would need to carry cargo that did not fit in any currently flying aircraft. It was called the CX Heavy Logistics System, or CX-HLS, and would be a wide-body fuselage with 4 engines on the wing. All 3 manufacturers designed the CX-HLS. The Lockheed C-5A won the bid. While Boeing did not get the design bid, it learned some valuable insight into wide-body aircraft design and engine technology. Jet travel was booming in the 1960s, and the world's airlines just couldn't get enough jets to manage the demand. Again, Pan Am's Juan Trippe was asking Boeing for a modern design that would carry 2.5 times the passenger load of a 707 and at 30% lower cost per seat. The 707 and DC-8 of that era carried about 140 passengers. Trippe was looking for an airliner with a capacity of 350 passengers. It was a daunting task for Boeing. This is a picture of Joe Sutter. He was the one that was tasked with the 747 program. This was a daunting task for Boeing because it was already busy with the 707, the 720, 727, 730s, and the SST program, and Apollo space program. The initial plan by Boeing marketing people suggested the 747 was just a stopgap airplane until the SST was in production. And they might just sell a few hundred airplanes. There's another design of this SST. So Sutter began the design process with his team. Pan American wanted a double-decker approach. They wanted that, but it was difficult with the evacuation times. So finally, Boeing had a design that would work, a wide-body twin-aisle concept of 10 abreast seating and coach with room for 8-foot cargo containers side by side below deck. The reason the 8-foot container was set was the standard for maritime use, so that it would be interchangeable with shipping. Trippe and Pan Am were not thrilled with the initial design but Boeing was able to convince them the 20-foot wide cabin would be spacious. Boeing's team met in New York's boardroom with Pan Am with a 20-foot piece of rope strung across a room to show how wide the cabin would be. Bill Allen and Juan Tripp sealed the deal with a handshake on an Alaskan fishing trip. Tripp said, "If you build it, I'll buy it." Allen responded, "If you buy it, I'll build it." Pan American ordered 25 Boeing 747s in April 1966 for $20 million each. Boeing agreed to deliver the aircraft by the end of 1969. This gave Sutter only 2 years, 8 months to design, build, roll out, and certify. He and his team of 4,500 personnel were dubbed the Incredibles. This is just the size difference between the 707 and the 747, much larger aircraft. Boeing also needed a place to build the wide body as Renton was too small, so Everett Payne Field was chosen for the building site. That's one of the buildings being built at Everett. The building would become the largest volume and size ever built, and still is today. So tight was the building of the aircraft, the building was not fully finished while the first 747 mock-up was being completed. The design of this jumbo would be nothing like any jetliner produced to date. The 707 had tremendous success and was a good starting point for the 747. Safety and airworthiness were paramount. A primary Boeing philosophy was that no single failure mode concept, meaning that no single failure or single structural failure would cause catastrophic loss of an aircraft. Redundancy was taken to the highest level in the design of the 747. The aircraft would have 4 large high bypass radial engines, producing 40,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft could safely land with just 2. 4 independent electrical generators to power systems. 1 could power if all needed, if needed. 4 independent hydraulic systems. 1 powering all flight controls during the in-flight emergency. Flight controls were split up so the hydraulic systems would power individual controls of the ailerons, elevator, and rudder. For example, and I know the schematic, this is a hydraulic schematic, but you see the different colors. The rudder was split to an upper and lower. If a hydraulic failure occurred to one of the systems, that would render the upper rudder inoperative, but the lower rudder would still operate from the other hydraulic system. So there was redundancy built in. Leading edge devices and trailing edge flap devices were powered primarily by hydraulic, but then alternate means electric motors. So if you lost hydraulics, you could still put the flaps down by electric. Also, a state-of-the-art cockpit with the latest avionics and 3 autopilots ensured landings at 0-0 visibility, if required. The design also would allow cargo loading of future freight versions through the main deck by the front nose door. The upper deck was planned for crew rest or in-flight lounge. Later, many airlines put more seats in the upper deck for more revenue. The interiors was designed with galleys and lavatories in the center of the passenger floor to allow more, make it look spacious by putting up partitions. This also gave the cabin a partition feel with the cabin broken into 5 main sections. Boeing selected the Pratt & Whitney JT9D engine to power the 747. It was the first high bypass jet engine to power a wide body. The problem was the aircraft was being built and not one engine type existed. The engine was a paper concept and it had yet to be built, evaluated, and delivered. Boeing also had to subcontract to other aviation builders like Northrop, Grumman, and Voight to help build and deliver components. And these are special train cars that would carry 747 parts from all over the country to Everett, Washington. And that one there is marked Northrop. So Northrop, there's a whole, if you dig in the internet, you can find there's a schematic of which manufacturers did the stabilizer and who did the landing gear. It wasn't just all Boeing. It was just too big of a project. The problem was they were just simply overwhelmed by all these Boeing jetliners being built at once, and the SST program was the big dog and took the lion's share of personnel. Sutter and his team worked long hours, working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. The world's economy faltered during the fall of 1967, and this deprived Boeing of much needed orders and revenue for the 747 and other jets in production. Typically, when airliners were purchased, they put down a small percentage and then they'd pay the full cost when it's delivered. The 747 program alone was costing $5 million per day. The SST program was a complete mess with costs of upward of $500 million, 200 of which Boeing had put up and the government had put up the remainder. Boeing had to approach more banks for loans and cap the shortfalls. And everything was riding on this program. Bill Allen later admitted he had many sleepless nights trying to figure out how Boeing could overcome all of this. Finally, on September 30th, 1968, the first 747, RA001, was rolled out in front of thousands. There's 26 airlines that placed orders for the new jet. First flight was planned to be the Wright brothers' 65th anniversary on December 17th, 1968, but engines excuse me, and other design issues delayed the flight. There's some more of the rollout pictures. The three test pilots were nicknamed the W's because their last names all began with W, of course. It was Jack Waddell, pilot, Brian Weigel, co-pilot Jess Wallach, flight engineer. They also had to design a special car that he could drive to, because the flight deck is 2.5 times higher than most narrow-body airliners, so there's a bit of a different perspective. Finally, the first flight occurred on February 9th, 1969. The initial flight was a success with only about an hour and a half. It was cut short due to some flight control issues. The plane flew very well during all its test flights through 1969. And the Boeing 747 was certified for flight on December 30th, 1969. That's a minimum speed unstick test to see if you will rotate early. They put a barrier on the tail so it wouldn't destroy the tail. In case inexperienced pilots rotated too early, they had to see what the airplane could do. The plane flew very well during all those tests of 69, like I said. 747 was certified end of December. So an astonishing array, 75,000 blueprint drawings, 4.5 million parts, 136 miles of wire, 10 million labor hours put the first Queen of the Skies in the air. Charles Lindbergh, who was a technical advisor on Pan Am's board, said of the 747, this is one of the great ones. This is some more test flights during 1969. This was the first flight on January 21st, 1970. Actually, that's the morning of the 22nd in London. The first flight was actually delayed until the 22nd because they had issues with the engines overtemping, and they had to substitute another 747, and it was Clipper Victor, and they had to quickly rename it Young America. It departed early morning of this 22nd for London, like I said. The jumbo jet age had arrived. Many airlines ordered and placed into service 747 to compete with Pan Am. But more importantly, It became an aerial ambassador for each airline or country. Some airlines were extremely poor financially, but a 747 in their fleet was a prestige symbol. Every one of the world's airlines had at least one 747 in their fleet, or almost every airline. The 747 became the plane of choice for long-haul travel. Tripp's vision of bringing affordable travel to the average citizen was an enormous success. Bringing air travel to the masses shrank the world and allowed for greater human connection, not ever deemed possible in prior generations. Pan Am reported that, to Boeing that its 747 costs were slightly under 7 cents per mile seat cost. And the upper deck design was pure genius. I'm missing a picture here. Is there a freighter? It's not. All right, we'll get to that. Sorry. One got out of sequence. My bad. So this allowed for a freighter version. So things could be loaded through the main deck, and then this allowed for freighter version to be the breadbasket of choices of the world's dinner table, whether it be fresh salmon from Norway or kiwi fruit from New Zealand. And that's true today. When I was growing up, I grew up in California, not so much, but like in Michigan, where I've lived for 35 years, in the wintertime, we wouldn't get strawberries and stuff like that because it wasn't available. Well, today it is, because they get grown from Chile or other parts of the world where they have their summers when we have our winters. Boeing also, airlines wanted more range and payload. So the Boeing 747-200B was delivered in January 1971. And it was a revised version of the Dash 100 with a higher takeoff gross weight of 833,000 pounds with a range of 6,500 miles. Northwest actually had the first B 747-200, but they did not take delivery till March. KLM actually took delivery of the first 747-200B in January of 1971. And the freighter version, Lufthansa was the launch customer for that, was delivered in April of 1972, so it had no windows. It was just all pure freighter. And you can see, here's an idea of what the freighter capacity was of that airplane, all laid out there in front. Another version, which was real important, long before the Airbus flew, there was a super Airbus at Boeing. The Japanese came to Boeing and said, listen, we need a 747 that will carry high density, 525 passengers, but it didn't need to have the range. So they built the 747 SR for Japan Airlines and ANA. And that would allow people to do island hopping between the Japanese cities to carry lots of people. Boeing also began offering customers the choice of engines, Pratt & Whitney, and then you could get a 747 with General Electric engines in 1972, and you could get an airplane with Rolls-Royce engines in 1975. That was the first ever with a jetliner where a manufacturer would offer all three jet engine types, and customers could pick what they want to do. And typically, Commonwealth nations, Qantas, Cathay Pacific, British Airways, Rolls-Royce products. In 1975, the Boeing 747 SP, Special Performance, was put into service to provide ultra-long range on non-stop routes like New York to Tokyo. Airline customers pushed again in the 80s. Sorry, there's some more SPs there. Got ahead of myself. Airline customers pushed again in the early 1980s for even a bigger, better 747 with range and advancement. Boeing 747-400 was delivered to Northwest Airlines in 1989. It was a standard 747 fuselage, but with new engines, wings, and cockpit. The substantial change in that cockpit systems were more modernized with flight management systems and electronic flight instruments, EFIS, thus removing hundreds of old-style instruments and switches. And this change design philosophy allowed for a 2-pilot crew instead of 3. The design was modified from the existing 757, 767 cockpit technology from 1982. The range of the 747-400 was now 7,650 miles and much better fuel savings. The Dash 400 became one of Boeing's best sellers of almost 700 aircraft. Yet again, customers wanted more. In 2005, when Airbus made A380 debut, Boeing began a brand new design with a longer fuselage, new wing, and engines. The first 747-8 freighter F, so shown here, flew in 2010, and then the passenger version in 2011. The Dash 8 was not a huge passenger seller with only a few big airlines ordering. The freighter version was more popular and ordered by many cargo airlines. Only 155 were delivered, and production ended on all 747s at the end of 2022. The last 747-8 was delivered to Atlas on January 31st, 2023. So now I got quite a number of pictures. Let's see what my time is. Yeah, I got a few minutes. Just a kind of a mismatch of 747 operators. There's no particular order. I'll just kind of, anyway, this is one of the early Pan Am deliveries. See the size of the Greyhound bus. Greyhound bus is pretty big. I think this flight, this was at the Le Bourget, it's probably during the Paris Air Show. It looks like Le Bourget. Could be. American was an early 747 operator. They converted many of theirs to freighters later. UPS, actually I worked at UPS, we had a whole bunch, we had 4 or 5. We actually had the Columbia Airport 75 airplane at one time. So, SAS was they had a few. I got the 500, 747 delivered. Swiss Air, Continental was an original 747 operator. They had 4 or 5, I think. You know, by the mid-70s, National, Continental, Delta, they all parked theirs because of economics, slowdown in the economies. National had 2. Vienna was, they had a number of them for many years. Air France was a big 747 customer. Qantas was always a big customer because they had those long routes. South African, same thing. Lufthansa, that's a delivery flight of their first Dash 100 at Boeing. British Airways was a big operator. They actually went on a retro scheme before they parted after COVID. KLM was a big 747 operator. UPS still has quite a fleet of 747s for their cargo operation. Sadly, this is ship 572. It was lost in Dubai in 2010 due to a cargo fire. That was our first fatality at UPS. We also had the classics back in the day for many years. And we also had the Dash 8 freighter. Libyan Airlines was going to be a customer, but due to political reasons, they did not get those airplanes. But I believe that's a test flight of one of them in Boeing. United got the SPs after the Pan Am merger, or they bought the Pacific routes. They also had the Dash 400. And this was one of their original delivery scheme. They were an original customer with 10 or 12. They did a lot of Hawaii with them. Transamerica was a charter operator. They had 3 in their fleet. And another South African. Singapore had quite a number of 400s. Sadly, that one took off on the wrong runway in Taipei and hit a bunch of construction equipment and crashed. But they had a big fleet of 747s as well. Northwest was a big customer. This is actually a artist concept before they changed their scheme. So it didn't operate in that color scheme, but that's one of the Reebok schemes. Lufthansa still flies the Dash 8, one of the few passenger carriers. Korean Air still flies them. Condor is I don't know if it still is a Lufthansa subsidiary. They had a couple 747s at one point. Korean Air again. Korean Air had a couple SPs back in the day. KLM, one of their delivery scheme flights, early 1970s. Japan Airlines, they were the largest 747 operator one time. They had over 100, and they did a bunch of different schemes with Disney and all that kind of stuff. Pretty colorful. Iran Air, when we had good relations with them, they were a 747 operator. I don't know if they fly them or not anymore. Probably don't. I saw one in Tokyo in 2004. That was the last time. Gulf Air had one or two. This is actually one of the Middle East airline birds. MEA, you'll see a couple pictures of it, a couple of slides. You know, they've always had some turmoil in the Middle East, so they were constantly leasing out their 747s to other carriers, probably to protect them, keep them out of harm's way. Flying Tigers was a big 747 carrier, and FedEx actually painted one in the purple scheme after the merger. That's probably an Atlas airplane, but it's flying for Emirates cargo. That looks like it's in Hong Kong. El Al is a big 747 operator. Eastern leased 747s from Pan Am in the wintertime and then gave them back to Pan Am in the summer. They were one of the original customers of the original 26 Eastern logos on the side of the prototype. But I don't know if they actually ever really got 747s that actually delivered to them. Of course, Delta, after the merger with Northwest, rebranded those 747s. So and this is one of their original 747s. Delta was probably the first airline that operated all three wide bodies at one time. They had the DC-10, Delta 11, and 747 in their fleet. China Air has SPs. That's in San Francisco. They did non-stop flights to Beijing. The British Airways, like I said, we talked earlier. Lots of different schemes. They went through they were always doing something fun. This is one of their pure cargo airplanes, Rolls-Royce. This is one of the original BOAC airplanes. Brandon had quite a few. This is a lease from American. This was their big orange, or they called it. This airplane flew Dallas, Honolulu, Honolulu, Dallas, Dallas, London, London, Dallas. That's all it did for a long time. It was one of the highest time 747s ever recorded. It worked a lot. They also bought SPs during their expansion. Avianca was a big 747. They had at least 3 or 4 in their fleet at one time. Of course, Atlas Air is still around with 747 freighters. Alia had some at one point. This is an interesting one. It didn't happen. Alaska had 1 or 2 on order. Oddly enough, some company in Willow Run Airport, a cargo airline, bought that airplane. That is a real picture. That's not artist concept. It flew in that color scheme, but was never delivered to Universal. It ended up going to Ward Air. Ward Air got those airplanes. But Universal was going to get 2 747s for PAX charters before they went bankrupt. New Zealand had a fleet of 747s. Air had some. Air France, I think this is one of their finale flights in Water Canyon when they retired the 747. There's an Air China Dash 8. Air Canada was a 747 operator as well as CP Air. Airliners had some. Like I said, almost every major airline had a 747 in their fleet. It was a prestige symbol. This is the final scheme. T2A operated. I think they had one or two in this scheme. They had a lot of them. And I was a big SP operator, and then those went to United. That was their final scheme, the billboard scheme. This is a 1970, I think it's an open house at LAX. If anyone knows John Proctor, his brother Bob was, I think, a pilot for them, or something. Can't remember. But he took a lot of pictures too, so this is out of John Proctor's collection. There's an early American one at JFK with the 747 luxury liner titles. And they also got, T2A had 3 SPs, and then American got them. They used them on two or three?
Two.
Two? Only two?
They got two, and Dubai government.
Oh, okay. All right. Iberia was a big carrier too. CPR, we talked about earlier. There's another United SP, Friendship One. Air Mauritius. Korean Air Cargo. They were one of the original early United deliveries. Another national. Original Delta. Another Continental. There's one of the MEA airplanes. MEA didn't operate it very much. They did early, but then not for a long time, and they had them later in their career. Coletta actually got the MEA airplanes. I flew them when I was a SP at T2A. There was one of the delivery schemes of 747 T2A. And United, one of the final schemes. And Korean Air. And the Delta, this was the first day, I'm trying to think, it was January 2009? That was the first Northwest airplane they made. They put it in Tokyo, Atlanta that day. That was their new brand. There's an updated MEA color scheme. And there's, I think that was the final scheme. Always had a tree on the tail. And that's a JAL cargo freighter at Everett before delivery. It's finalized checks. Bonus, like I said, they were a big operator. All-Nippon Cargo has the Dash 8 freighter. There's a BOAC, that's from Detroit area, because I did a presentation about Detroit 747. I threw a couple of those in Northwest. Sabina had 2 Dash 100s, and they actually sent theirs back to become combis. So they were the first airline to operate a combi. They felt it was better to, they couldn't fill up the airplane with passengers, they make it half cargo, half people. So still a few of those around, or was. KLM had some for a while.
So did Lufthansa.
Yeah, Lufthansa does. Interesting thing is the FAA would never allow this. But every airline in the world except the US carriers allow to put the cargo in the back. And the FAA won't do that because they're afraid, well, the airplane crashes or something, the cargo will all come forward. So any split cargo freighter in the US, the cargo's always been in the front. Like Aloha, not Aloha, Alaska and Air Calhoun had, and the cargo was up front, the 737. And that's a British Airways at Detroit.
I was going to say, that looks like that's where it was.
Yeah. Northwest at Detroit in their final scheme before the merger. Alitalia used to serve Detroit as well. There's a whole lineup of wide bodies in the day at Detroit. World Airways was also an operator of 747s. They had 2 or 3. We talked earlier about American. They actually converted some of their freighters, or for the passenger, to make them freighters. It was more economically possible to do that. Alitalia, they actually flew parts to Detroit Auto, Cadillac. They flew stuff from Italy. So Pan Am had a couple cargo 747s as well. And there's one, that's the Iran Air one I was talking about earlier at Narita. And Qantas, they had a couple 7SPs as well. This airplane,
Who is this?
There's a fun story about this. I had to show this. This airplane, I think it was owned by Coletta, but then this airline called Baltia wanted to start. They got their manuals and everything. This airplane never flew. It sat at Willow Run for years. It would move around. One part of the ramp, then it'd be somewhere else. And finally it got ferried to Oscoda, and I think it's been scrapped. But it just sat around the airport. It never went anywhere.
Who was Baltia supposedly?
It's what?
Ostensibly, what airline was
It
this?
was called Baltia.
Yeah.
It was somewhere in one of the Baltic states or something. Latvia?
Yeah, Riga.
I mean, you could Google it, maybe find out. It never, nothing ever happened. It was I think Connie took care of it, so. And then I thought I'd show a couple special use for it. There's been some interesting uses of course, the space shuttle, and an ex-American airplane did the space shuttle for many years, moved it around. And the Air Force had one -400, some sort of airborne jamming communication 7-4. I think it's parked now. I think it's
scrapped, I believe.
Yeah. Of course, there's the NASA SP that just, I think, is it still flying?
No,
Retired.
It's at
Retired.
HEMA, Air and Space.
Yep.
It's open for
GE has, I think they retired the one. GE uses them for the test bed, to test different engines. Of course, there was one firefighter one. That one's no longer a firefighter, but it was one for a long time. And of course, there's the Dreamlifter. You still see those around, moving parts with a 787. And then you got the E4 airborne AWACS, special stuff. And then of course you got the presidential airplanes. And there is going to be a new one at some point. It's supposed to look like that. So in closing, what began in the mid-1960s to design, build, and fly a brand new concept was nothing short of a miracle. Men with genius put in thousands of hours to find the right one. And this is a picture of it. This is Bill Allen, one trip, and I'm going to put Joe Sutter in there because he was part of they were true visionaries to see all this to completion. The 747 was supposed to be a stopgap airplane that was going to be overshadowed by the SST. Nothing was further from the truth. The 747 was the dominant wide-body aircraft until 2005, when Airbus introduced the A380. It ran without competition for years. In all, 1,574 747s were built over 50 years. At its peak, 350 747s were in the air at any one moment, carrying 150,000 passengers. She carried over 6 billion people, 60 billion miles. The world certainly appreciated what she did to make our world a smaller place. And that tells you how tough that airplane is. I wasn't there at Coletta, but they got an authorization to get a 3-engine ferry. They didn't tell the FAA they were just going to take the engine off. So the chief pilot I knew, he took that picture. It's on Airliners, he's got that. But it flew without the engine.
Yeah.
So. And if you haven't had enough of my talk, Airways February 2024 issue has the article about the 747.